Thank you for joining me on the Bold Lines podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the rise of legal drug dealers. At first, this might sound a little pretentious or over the top. Initially, I thought the same until in the past few months, I've seen the rise of some things that are incredibly concerning. This episode is created entirely out of necessity. I feel a little bit nuts even considering doing this episode, not because I'll get in trouble, but some of the things that I'm going to explain to you today are just ridiculous. These issues have been creeping up over time. Probably since the mid-2010s, we've been seeing some of this stuff coming down the pipeline. In practice, mostly, some of the more recent things have just come out of nowhere. This new wave of issues with legal drug dealers is a reaction to past legal interventions for drug use and FDA loopholes. We'll get into that a little bit as we go, but I do want to start with, how did we get here? I'm going to be taking plenty of pot shots today. I say that with as much quotation marks as I can portray in an audio recording, but some of the things and places that I'm going to go after in this episode, I'm going to be unashamedly denouncing. Now, some people might be upset with it, and that's fine, but it needs to be called out. A lot of this legal drug dealing started with smoke shops. Now, if you ever went to one of these things some time ago, they were usually famous for a couple things. One was tobacco, either loose or packaged, and ways to roll tobacco, heavy quotes there. They were also famous for their glassware, which, as they advertised, was only for smoking tobacco, because that's what everyone uses a water pipe for. We all know what it was for. And even before some of the craziness of today, it was pretty common to see ways that you could hide marijuana in canisters or otherwise. But that was where a lot of this started. It was a place where people knew how to get pipes and glassware for marijuana. And of course, there were tobacco sales. But there were some other things as well, like hookah, but that really hasn't been a thing for a while. Now, how did we get to where things were even worse? Why would this become an issue? Well, it was stable for a while up until vaping came on the scene. So what is vaping? We've all heard of it at this point. Let me break it down in a way that makes sense. All vaping is a concentrate from a particular substance in a way that it looks for the active chemical or the part that makes you feel good. Most vaping is a nicotine vape, or as a lot of kids call them, nicks, or nicotine, or however you want to put it. Some variation of that is what I've heard, even in my own practice. So these different companies take the nicotine from tobacco and they distill it into a concentrated amount. So much so that in order to get the same amount of nicotine that you could get in a vape, you would have to smoke an absurdly large amount of cigarettes. I will admit, there are some vapes that are only for flavor or for the scent, which is just weird. You're going for a taste in something that affects your lungs. Okay, I guess, but let's be real. The vast majority of vaping has at least nicotine in it. If you want to know, well, who came up with this? It's a company called Juul. You can research that company on your own time if you feel the need, but Juul really revolutionized and ruined this space because not only could they create that concentrate, that nicotine salt, as it's called, they found a way to make it compact, and very significantly, they were sued for practices that were seemingly marketed to children. You heard that correctly. Highly concentrated nicotine, like would be in a whole bunch of cigarettes marketed to children. Another big issue in all of this, it was so small that kids could hide it in pockets, in jackets, and anywhere else from teachers and parents. Once vaping came on the scene, it really started taking over. I remember hearing about a lot of this in my own schooling as kids would, as we'd say, get addicted to a thumb drive. It was very, very small. And if you didn't know what you were looking for, people a lot of times just didn't even know what it was. There's the small vapes, the ones that are easy to hide. There's also the more bulky ones as well. I will say, though, these nicotine salts being highly concentrated creates a big, big issue in terms of how much you can ingest. One of the drawbacks from cigarettes, or at least the smoking of cigarettes, was that if you took in too much smoke, you would cough. It would naturally slow you down. Vapes circumvent that problem. There isn't the tar, there isn't the coughing, there isn't all of those things. You just get the chemical and the what it's called juice that allows it to be transported to you. So no coughing means that you can continually take it in, and at higher levels of concentrate, you can get it much more quickly. Now, here's the crazy thing for parents that are unaware. Smoke shops and rundown gas stations can sell to children pretty regularly. This seems to be a prevalent trend all over the US. I'm not sure outside of the US, but here it's decently well known that smoke shops and rundown gas stations will sell this stuff to kids. Sometimes all they have to do is just flash their ID. So the teller has plausible deniability to some degree. In some cases, these, let's call them dealers, are so used to having these kids in that they greet them. It's some of the most wild things that I've ever heard. Here's the other part. Let's say that one of these people finds themselves to be morally above selling nicotine vapes to children. What also happens is someone who just barely meets the threshold for being able to purchase them buys them in bulk. And why do you think they buy them in bulk? To sell them at an upcharge to younger people. So there isn't really a way to getting it sold to children. It's marketed, people are willing to sell it, and kids are able to hide it. There was a new revolution in vaping. Those levels of concentration can be varied amongst all different kinds of vapes and companies, but there was yet another revolution to take place. We already had cigarettes, but something was conspicuously missing from smoke shops, and that was marijuana. Some states have legalized marijuana use, and so there are shops that are mostly dedicated to that. Although there's a whole issue with the regulation and black market weed becoming popular again because of how much everything costs, the same technology that was used in that nicotine concentrate was used in the THC that is in marijuana, the euphoria, the part that can become addictive. See, here's the thing. I talked about this earlier, the laws and FDA regulations. Marijuana has a restriction. Specifically, THC is gray. And anywhere that there's gray, there's a company and people that are willing to push the boundaries as far as they will go. So while marijuana might be illegal in most states, THC is mostly unregulated. If you're wondering what this is called, most of the time I've heard it called pens, weed pens, or carts, short for cartridge. And these kids know exactly what they are. They know what they're called. And they know, hey, I can basically just get marijuana, but I can get it somewhat legally and in a high level of concentration. So you can have kids. Let's roll this back for just a second. You can have kids who go to the right smoke shops or to the rundown gas stations, and they can buy high levels of concentrated marijuana. If you weren't aware of this, or you're in some place outside of the US, and this might be new information to you, this is what we're dealing with now. And as a therapist, I'm watching this play out both in my own practice and in research. Research is behind, as all research is, if it's scientifically bound. But this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. Now, this might sound bad enough. Maybe weed isn't the devil's lettuce, but we can all understand that high levels of a psychoactive substance that is given freely to children without supervision is a bad idea. It affects their psychology, it affects their motivation, all of those things. Well, there's a newcomer on the block. It's the reason why I'm pushing this episode earlier in my schedule. The newest fad in smoke shops and rundown gas stations are legalized whippets. Now, if you're a little bit older, you know what whippets are if you've been in any kind of party scene. It's nitrous oxide or laughing gas, or as where some of those FDA regulations come in, they are whipped cream chargers. It's the stuff you spray, right? Here's the crazy thing. Those whippets were difficult to get in the past because there were only specific areas that you could obtain it. If any dentist office still uses this, and I'm sure there are, nitrous oxide or laughing gas is present there. But it wasn't as easy to access as it is now. Here's the thing. Whippets are notorious for two things. One, they only last a few minutes. It's not a high that will take you hours and hours and hours or a day. It doesn't last super long. The second thing that they're notorious for is absolutely frying brain cells. Those that have taken them in the past or know someone who was addicted to them, they can attest to this. So now we have a third party that is vying for the most insane thing being openly sold to children. I'm going to take it one step further. Not only is it being sold, this thing that gives you a short high but absolutely fries brain cells, it's actually being branded. I've been hesitant on whether or not I was actually going to say the name of this, but chances are if you're listening to this episode, you're one of two people. Someone who is using these things or is interested in them and was curious how it all works, or someone who wants to learn. So for that reason, I'll go ahead and name it. The most insane thing that I have seen that children openly buy and use is called Galaxy Gas. That's the branding. If you go on their website, please try to give them limited traffic. But they've created a whole branding around whippets, nitrous oxide. Here's the scary thing. Back in the day, Juul got sued. I said that earlier in this episode. They got sued for marketing to children by using flavors. They use these flavors that activists and parents argued were primarily for children. It wasn't cherry or mint. It's things like bubblegum and cake. Well, for all of those people that were upset at Juul back then, they've got a new fight because Galaxy Gas has every kind of flavor you'd want. Here's something that is absolutely insane. If I haven't said that word enough for this episode, if anyone's ever been to a coffee shop and you see the little whipped cream cans that they spray on your coffee, and they have those little chargers, those little inserts. Those are nitrous oxide, most likely. Little itty-bitty canisters. Well, Galaxy Gas doesn't sell those. Oh, no. Because they're going to leverage this gray area for as long as possible. They sell these absolutely gigantic canisters. Now, I haven't held one because I haven't confiscated it and I refuse to buy one. These things look about almost a foot tall. They're huge and they're very round. It is way too much for anything useful. It is branded for children. If you look at the packaging on it, it looks like it's branded for children. If you want to look some of this up on social media, you can. Again, not the most recommended thing that you could do listening to my podcast, but if you look up Galaxy Gas, mostly on TikTok, you can watch minors absolutely fry their brains, some kids passing out, And it seems like a lot of people are chill about it, but there does seem to be a little bit of pushback. Again, it is absolutely, I'm even dumbfounded, and I wrote a script for this. Every episode has a script, and I'm dumbfounded even reading what I have written here. Now, I'm no Nancy Reagan. I'm not going to go on the just say no train for anything and everything because it doesn't work for children. Their brains don't work that way. So I'm not going to take the overly evil approach to absolutely everything about it. I do not necessarily believe that kids in possession of all of these things should serve jail time. Now, this is where there's a lot of debate, and I'm not even 100% settled on some of these things. Because all of this stuff is legal, it's really hard to legislate how kids can have it and how to even catch them having vapes or anything of the sort. However, I do think that the dealers should be prosecuted heavily. This is very similar to my stance in drug addiction itself, where could there be a case for criminalizing drug possession? It depends. For dealers, prosecute 100%. Remember, one of the biggest reasons we are in this catastrophe is because there is a loophole in regulations and laws that allow for it. There is a very, very prominent example of this. It didn't seem to take off as much in popularity as some of these other things, but the supplement industry is largely unregulated. You can pretty much say a supplement does whatever. And if the FDA eventually starts pushing back, then you just slightly change it and they have to go through a whole other approval process. But there was a quote unquote supplement that came out a little while ago called Kratom. If you've driven by any of these smoke shops and you've wondered what it is, here's the short version. It's kind of like this little leafy substance. At least that's what most people have described to me. There have been pill forms, but it's this thing that you can put in tea, you can chew, whatever it is. But in small doses, it gives you an upper effect, gives you some sort of stimulant effect. In large doses, gives you a downer or similar to a narcotic effect. That makes Kratom rather interesting because while it's not necessarily a narcotic, you can get similar effects and it's illegal. Not as popular, but I think that's a great example of why there are so many issues with regulation. So what do we do? I'm going to admit I don't have the perfect answer. I know at this point that trying to regulate every single chemical structure is going to create a problem. Because we've gotten so advanced in chemistry, any of these companies or individuals can just slightly alter a chemical structure, and then all of a sudden it's legal. This is why you see things like Delta 8 and Delta 9. They're functionally much the same chemical, but with that slight variance, they have different levels of regulation, which at this point isn't really anything at all. Parents, you really need to know how easy this is to get. Either if your kid is actually brave enough or desperate enough to go look for it on their own, or parents also need to know that they can get some of these things from friends. It is not uncommon for teenagers, God forbid someone younger than a teenager, can go to a friend and ask for a hit. Just take a hit off their vape. It's quite common practice from what I've heard, whether that's in between classes, locker room, bathroom, whatever it is. It's pretty easy to do. In fact, you don't even have to go see a dealer and you don't even have to use a lot of it. For kids that are highly sensitive to THC because they don't use it, it's pretty easy for them to get high because if they ask a friend and the friend has one, it seems fairly likely that they'll let him hit the vape. My goodness, I just made myself sound really old. I need to remind everyone listening that nicotine is not a good thing for children. Developing brains need the space to grow, and introducing an addictive substance can create long-term issues. I've talked about this in a previous episode. But we've moved from nicotine. We've moved from these highly concentrated cigarettes to marijuana. They sell THC, and whippets, now called galaxy gas. I don't know how the law plays out on this. I mentioned this just a moment ago. You can go on a rabbit chase to try to find every chemical to make illegal. There's another issue with making it illegal. In some places, like Oregon, they have found that making something legal, like marijuana, and taxing it heavily allows for a high level of taxes to be gained. So, in governments that are more concerned about getting funding for certain things, there can very easily be a temptation to allow it and just tax it. For the sake of our children, though, this is absolutely crazy. As someone who has worked in addiction for a while, who has researched and written about it, I am absolutely beside myself that kids can very easily get concentrated nicotine, THC, and now whippets. I have a prediction, though. I think I know what comes next, and you can bookmark it, and if I'm right, someone email me and tell me. But I think what comes up next is legalized mushrooms. Someone's going to figure out how to isolate the active chemicals in mushrooms, psilocybin, and that's going to be next. Eventually, what my great fear is that all of these shops will find a way to sell active ingredients of previously either inaccessible or illegal substances. So what do? I have absolutely no idea. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a therapist. I like research. I like doing research. I couldn't tell you what the answer is other than if you're a parent in here, please talk to your children. All of this stuff is a terrible idea. This is not the same marijuana. I know many people have heard, well, this marijuana today is 17 times, no, the more likely estimate is about 4 times as potent as it was in the 90s. That's marijuana with selective breeding. We're not talking about THC vapes. If you're a parent, please talk to your children. Know who they hang out with. For the love of all that is good, please do not let them get anywhere near these things, especially this galaxy gas. I don't care if I'm sounding old or I'm sounding decrepit. This stuff is terrifying to me. If you're someone who wants to learn how addiction works, how to treat it, if you're a parent or a loved one, or you want to learn yourself, in the saved links of this episode, you can find my website. There's media links where I've given talks. There's books that I've written. There are resources out there. But for those that are just curious, please step back and wait and do not try it. I am so concerned for what happens in the next 5 to 10 years. Thank you for listening today. This is one of the most scary episodes that I've ever recorded. If you found this useful, I hope that you follow the podcast, share this episode with others so that hopefully they can avert disaster for themselves or someone else. If you feel the need to tip this podcast to help pay for the production, you can do so. And thank you so much for listening and have a great day.